Hi, everyone, and welcome to SPE Live. I'm Trent Jacobs, the digital editor of the Journal of Petroleum Technology. We're talking today with two experts about the winter storm that hit Texas and became one of the biggest energy stories that we've seen in years. Less than 2 weeks ago, freezing temperatures, snow, and ice impacted wind turbines, coal plants, natural gas plants, and even a nuclear power plant here in Texas. The result was the loss of power to more than 4.5 million homes and businesses across the state, which is the second largest in the U.S. The oil and gas sector was hit especially hard as well. We saw wellhead freeze-offs. We saw pictures of separator units parting and refineries shut down. At the peak, estimates say that as much as 4 million barrels a day was offline because of this storm, along with 10 BCF of gas. These are just stunning, huge numbers from such an unprecedented winter event here. Here to discuss the impact and some of the nuances of this perfect storm of sorts is Ed Hers, Energy Fellow at the University of Houston. And we have Joshua Rhodes, a research associate at the Web Energy Group at UT Austin. We were going to have Anas Al-Haji with Energy Outlook Advisors joining us, but he had a scheduling conflict and was unable to join us. But Ed, welcome. I want to start with you. For those watching outside of Texas and especially in the U.S. Or outside of the U.S., give us the short version on why Texas has a unique energy grid and how that played a role in the way things unfolded a week and a half ago.
Well, the energy. Thank you so much, Trent. The energy grid in Texas is essentially as large as most nations' grid, half again larger than anything else in the U.S. For example, we kind of look at peak demand somewhere around 75 gigawatts in the summer. The California grid maxes out at about 45 gigs. And so Texas has a portfolio of assets across the grid, nuclear, gas, wind, a little bit of solar. Last week, in what is typically the off season, a lot of the plants weren't ready to come on. They hadn't been winterized. They had no antifreeze. They hadn't purged the lines. Same thing in the gas fields that we were talking about. Some of the gas fields, one of the companies that I advise, they started shutting down everything the Wednesday before the polar vortex arrived because they knew they had water and moisture in their flow lines and their gathering systems. They didn't want to have their gun barrels freezing. Goodness, they went through, shut in all the wells in preparation. So as a result, they got back to work last weekend in perfect order. A lot of folks around the state didn't do that. The electricity companies, because the generators are on, because they're only compensated on an electricity only basis, they only make revenues when they're actually turning electrons into the grid. Many of them shut down at the end of September and just leave the plants alone until they come back in July. Every 10 years or so, we have one of these nasty polar vortexes that zips on in. They can't respond to demand, and so we have shortfalls on the grid. And unfortunately, it really mushroomed this past week and caused a huge amount of tragedy. Ridiculous fleecing of consumers' pockets, as much as $40 billion on some estimates, as much as the Texas grid revenue over the last 3 years. And then estimates on the property and casualty side of $50 billion in losses. And last count I heard, more than 50 deaths attributed to this. This was a tremendous failure of imagination, of governance, of just common sense.
Well, thanks for the overview, and it's already being expected to be the costliest natural disaster in Texas history. So I want to come back to that, but I also want to bring in you, Joshua, and I want to get this out of the way. That one of the first things about this energy crisis that we saw was a blame game erupt. This, largely was pitting wind turbines against natural gas supply. We know the real story now is a bit more complex, as Ed just kind of outlined there, and every energy source was impacted. But I'm wondering if you can explain to me, maybe why the blame game erupted the way it did, and is there still any confusion on that point?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's I mean, during events like this, there's never, shortages of hot takes and people with, preferred technologies and things, and preferred interest and things like that. And so it's, I mean, the blame games were starting even before this event happened. Because I mean, by the time, we saw the meteorological report and we saw how cold it was going to get, and that doesn't get that cold here in Texas for that long, in the past, the blame game started before the event even happened. And so people were getting, ready for it. So that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I think as we see more of the actual data come out to know, who went down, what fuels went down, which technologies went down, how much each produced during this event, close to or below or, way below kind of what the grid operator, was counting on them to be, during these events. I mean, we're seeing more of that, picture. And as you said, I mean, every technology, was affected by this. We were down a few thousand megawatts of wind for icing issues and other things like that. We were down a few tens of thousands of megawatts from our thermal fleet, be that, gas and coal, nuclear. It seems like everybody, was touched on this. And we were also having issues upstream, with our gas, with getting fuel to our power plants. So I mean, it was, everybody, and yeah, I mean, we push both of these energy grids, the electricity and the gas grid, beyond anything we had ever designed them to handle.
Ed, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the lasting impact of this blame game, because these narratives tend to have long tails, right? What does it mean for the wider energy transition, which requires regions to depend on an energy mix? It's inherent, right? Is this harder than most people thought when they look at the Texas example? Should other countries take note of what happened here? Or is this a black swan that sort of could only happen here?
Well, it's not a black swan. We had the same thing happen in 2011. We've had these issues in 2011. The load shedding events, we call them blackouts, caused a great tragedy in Dallas when they dropped the load shedding or blackout right on top of the Dallas Medical Center, and the units weren't ready to fire up at that point. This is just a matter of the way this market was structured. I mean, too many people are going around saying, well, the Texas market was deregulation. No, it was just regulated differently. You can't free up one part of a market that's still very, very well regulated and expect it to work efficiently and optimally and reward the participants. So for the last 10 years, the revenues received by the generators was less than the cost of providing the electricity. And so we just saw this going forward. It's a monopsony. Folks outside the U.S. probably pay more attention to this than we do, but the guys in the legislature and the governors actually created an old style Soviet purchasing bureau when they created the ERCOT market. And so with folks competing, there was no incentive to reinvest and keep the grid resilient. In fact, there was every incentive to pull generation off the grid to drive us into a short squeeze and drive prices up. It was just a matter of time before an event during one hot summer day or one cold winter's day exposed the shortcomings of this market design. We're going to have to essentially change the regulation here in Texas. The governor spoke up last night and, sounding like Bernie Sanders, government's going to make sure the winterization is done. I know heads are exploding in Austin right now because this is an anathema to what they've been preaching and believing over the last 20 years as they've steered us to this debacle.
Both of your thoughts on this one. And so, when we talk about winterization, I think that, a lot of us, maybe don't know what we're talking about, right? So what kind, to the best of y'all's knowledge, what kind of investment upgrades to the infrastructure are really being discussed when people talk about winterization? And then Ed, I think that you had an op-ed recently talking about, that in some jurisdictions in some U.S. states, the winterization or the upgrade efforts are, compensated for by government, and essentially subsidized to ensure the integrity of the grid. So I want to get your thoughts on what does winterization mean? Do you see incentive packages, helping the matters?
I mean, so it's unclear to me exactly how, we're talking winterization, we're talking about hardening the grid against these cold weather events, and so making sure that the power plants can get the cooling water during that they can run their cooling water systems during this time, and making sure that they're able to produce electricity. I think this needs to go beyond that sector, because particularly in the wintertime, like our gas sector and our electricity sector are coupled in multiple different ways. I mean, in the summer, where we're used to handling these high loads, all the gas is flowing to power plants, and there's no competition for it from elsewhere. But 40% of homes in Texas 40% of home businesses in Texas were trying to consume natural gas at the same time. And it just led to that system couldn't deliver to both power plants and homes. And we had these cascading failures, and potentially some electric compressor pumps weren't able to turn on because they got turned off in the blackouts, and so weren't able to keep the gas going. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of these interconnectedness, and just looking at one, I think is not going to help us out here. But in Texas, that's going to be difficult because we have two different regulatory agencies. We have the Public Utility Commission, oversees electricity. We have the Railroad Commission, which oversees natural gas. And so we're going to have to go back and forth on. I mean, we're going to have to figure out some way to work between those agencies, and hopefully that will happen at the legislature. And it's not clear to me how this will be paid for necessarily. I mean, we have a fully regulated transmission sector in Texas, and so that costs for upgrades and things like that are rate based and go into uplift charges that are spread out amongst all consumers. But the way our system works right now, since these generation assets for the most part are not rate based, it's going to be some kind of new vehicle, some kind of new way of doing this that we haven't seen before, and I've yet to see kind of what that will necessarily look like.
Ed, what about you? How do you work the machinations to cover the cost of winterization? Texas is a huge state, lots of energy production systems here, including raw, hydrocarbons. So what's the best path forward on trying to do that?
Yeah, the oil and gas companies know how to do this. We ran an operator in Colorado and Wyoming. Yeah, it gets really cold there, but we know how to operate. And I advise and am part of some companies here in Texas. Our guys have the management expertise to kind of think ahead about these disasters. And so, take the field down, make sure everything's set for winterization. Yeah, you spend a little money, an extra 20 cents a barrel, an extra, 5 pennies an MCF, but you have something that's resilient and can continue to operate in the grid. And, again, with the generators not being compensated in their off period, they're not paid to do this, and they have the incentive not to do it. They have an incentive to actually drive the Texas grid to a short squeeze, because the other units that they have operating will now get hundreds of times the revenue they would have received otherwise. This sort of collusion, a tacit collusion, is a term of art in antitrust. I think we're going to see all sorts of ugly things come out as we start unwinding it. For Texas to stand up and say, hey, we've got this great grid, we've got great power, and you can't manage it as well as any of the other states around you, is a terrible black eye for the leadership, not only of the state, but of the industry. It's the same generator unit that they use in Buffalo. All it requires is if you're in really bad shape, just call the guy in Buffalo. Hey, what do I need to do to get my GE unit ready to go? There's going to be a lot of blame and game with the molecules and the electrons, but that's actually not the problem. That's the symptom.
I want to peg down this one aspect of the crisis, which has been getting some coverage recently. And we saw that as power plants went down, this cycle began. Oil and gas fields that were relying on grid power, they started, going down and putting less gas and pressure into the midstream units that were feeding those same power plants or other power plants. So sort of a downward spiral of sorts. And so there's been some thought about trying to harden or protect this gas supply that's largely in West Texas and South Texas and a little bit in East Texas. It's all over. But does that make sense? Protecting gas supplies just so that they can always, despite a big power outage, get to power plants and keep things running.
Well, I mean, I think if we're going to continue to rely on, 50% of our generation capacity being natural gas and, 45% of our, energy mix being natural gas, I mean, we're going to have to do something about that. I mean, when ERCOT, did their projections based on, what they thought was going to be available, they assumed that they would have, they assumed they would have 90% of their thermal fleet or something like that. Whereas, at the end of the day, 40% of it, was offline, and a big part of that was due to, fuel supply issues to getting to natural gas plants. And so, I mean, if we're going to continue to rely on those things, I think we're, going to have to do something, like that. I mean, we've considered natural gas. We've had plenty of natural gas storage just in the ground. We turn on the wells and, it flows. But, in this case, we've shown that is, maybe that's an assumption that with our current technology we have out there, is not a good one to make.
Yeah, and again, Trent, I want to make the point that none of this should be a surprise. It's happened before, and and typically we see fields go offline when a hurricane comes in. This infrastructure impact is very pointed and localized, but with the polar vortex that we just experienced last week, it was a systemic attack on all of Texas.
Yeah, Joshua, I want to throw this one at you because news just broke yesterday that the Texas grid was 4 minutes and a few seconds away from a total collapse, which the grid operator said would have taken weeks or months before a full restoration of power across the state happened. And so I have two things on this. One, what exactly, how did the cold weather and ice actually affect power plants from a technical engineering angle to make them shut down? Are we talking about frozen pipes? What are we talking about? And then B, how does this end up being 4 minutes away from a total statewide collapse?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the uncomfortable truths about the system is like grids are always really that close to going down. I mean, if you hit a grid hard enough, if you drop enough power plants at the same time, like there's only so much that like a system operator can do with reserves and everything that they have at their disposal, to prop the system back up. And so what, ERCOT saw that morning as on Monday morning on the 15th was, they had a lot of generation plants out. Demand was skyrocketing because, temperatures were dropping across the state. And they kept having more generators trip offline. And we've seen pictures from folks like Entergy that have shown, cooling towers that are completely iced up and they can't, cool their water down to make their boiler remake water. We saw, some instrumentation froze, I think on the South Texas Project nuclear plant. One of their reactors, went down because a backup water system froze, and they have multiple redundant systems, obviously for things like nuclear. And so I think on the power plant side, there was, and for coal, same thing with, water cooling. The power plant side, we had, cooling water issues. They can't, obviously these are thermal plants, so they get hot. They need cooling water. If they can't get that, they have to shut down. If they can't get gas at the right pressure, they either have to derate or they have to turn themselves off. And so, I mean, I think those are the kind of the issues at the power plant level, itself that we saw.
Right, and then in terms of flipping this from a week long or a 5 day long event into a 2 month long event.
Okay.
I'm just curious. Why would it take so long to bring back? And then I want to get onto the other side of some of the implications of that with Ed.
Yeah. No, I mean, so black start events take a long time to come up, and so if the entire grid went down, there's only. Not all power plants are like cars where you can walk out, turn a key and the thing starts. I mean, a lot of these power plants they have to pull energy from the grid to get all of their cooling systems operational, to get some bit into their operations in order to, be able to go back on. And plus, if you have a massive failure of the grid, if you have a controlled cutoff, like if power plants control, turn off gracefully, if you will, they're usually able to kind of protect themselves. But if the entire thing went down at the same time and frequency got so far off, you could actually have mechanical issues in power plants because they're the big spinning steel shafts inside of these things are mechanically coupled, to the frequency of the grid. And if there's too much pushback against that, we've seen instances where they've snapped before, where you break things, bearings get out of whack. I mean, a whole lot of stuff that, mechanically we might have to go in and fix before power plants can come back on. And if you lose telemetry on the grid and you have to use different power plants to jumpstart other power plants, sometimes you might have to actually send out people physically to turn off feeders and turn on feeders to make sure that the power flows. And you have to bring the grid on very, very slowly at the time. So, I mean, it could have taken weeks, if not months, depending on how much damage, a complete collapse, caused at individual power plants.
Ed, based on what Josh has said, we saw oil prices already take a little spike past yearly highs as this event happened and ended. So I'm curious, when you hear about nightmare scenarios like losing the grid for a month or longer, is that a wake up call enough, even more so than what actually happened? And what I'm thinking about it particularly is the oil and gas business, which you would have taken 4.5 million barrels of oil a day off world markets. So what would that have meant broadly, not just here in Texas, but in global markets?
Well, I think what's going on in the oil market right now is really related to the fact the Saudis have dialed back production and have decided that the price should be higher. And a couple of days interruption out in West Texas is not going to do anything. I'm not an engineer, so I 6 to 8 weeks because the grid goes down. Assuming we don't have a Stuxnet type of thing, which Josh was talking about, that we could have with equipment blowing apart. 20 years ago, a tree fell in Cleveland. The Atlantic seaboard grid went down. Somebody flipped the wrong switch in Arizona a couple of years ago and took down Southern California's grid. It took, a day and a half to get everything back. I don't know that these doomsday scenarios are there, and that we would have experienced that across Texas had the whole grid gone down. It's very difficult for us to take anything that comes out of ERCOT or the PUC at face value. The obfuscation, hiding data, hiding information. I mean, even ERCOT almost sued the PUC last year because they disagreed with what a staffer had said, and they went on a hunt to find who the staffer was. It's just remarkable to watch how the dynamics of this imperious grid operator operate, the fecklessness of the public utility commissioners. There's no accountability. No one takes responsibility. And then the generators and the traders walk away with billions of dollars at the expense of the state.
Joshua, I wanted to ask you on something. Ed's been bringing up a lot of analogies. He's brought up the Texas winter event in 2011. I'm just curious, from where you sit, do you see the analogies as similar to this event?
Yeah, I mean, so we had issues in 2011 for sure. I mean, it was a deep freeze. We had some blackouts. They weren't as bad as they were here, and then meteorological conditions weren't as bad as they were for here. I mean, this freeze was deeper, longer, and more widespread than the 2011 event. Now, the 2011 event should have taught us lessons. It should have taught us lessons about winterization. It should have taught us lessons about firming the gas supply. It should have taught us all of these lessons that, at the end of the day were made, best practices and, not, compulsory. But I mean, I also kind of want to push back against this, idea that it's the market design necessarily to blame. I mean, we saw to the north of us, the Southern Power Pool, which has a wholesale market, but the individual utilities are vertically integrated. They were also having issues with this. And I would assume that they would be, a little more accustomed to winter weather. And we had to the east of us in Louisiana, the way more regulated areas, also were having, blackouts. In fact, I think they might be still having blackouts as of the last day or so. So, I mean, and the thing with the capacity market, well, I mean, if you can't get fuel to your plants, we could have had double the amount of, say, natural gas power plants, which is what Texas probably would have put in their capacity markets. And it's not clear to me that, they would have been able to get fuel either. And so and on some level, like the storm, it pushed these things beyond what I think we would have planned for, even if we had been a regulated system. So I'm not as quick, as some others to throw the baby out with the bathwater here.
Well, I don't think it's really throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The fact is, the market took about $40 billion from consumers last week and performed miserably. There was no delivery. And so you can't tell me that's not a gaming situation. That came right out of Enron in 2000, 2001 in the California market. And nobody learned the lesson then. Nobody learned the lesson in 2011. There have been many instances of short squeezes and market manipulation. In 2014, GDF Suez was tagged publicly for creaming 300 plus million off the top of the market. This is an issue of governance and market design. Once we can take care of that, then we've got a better chance of maybe having the engineers actually do stuff that they're supposed to do to keep the grid hard. Yeah, I mean,
of course, no. We call it a deregulated system, but there are regulations in the system, and they should have taken those lessons from 2011. They should have, done that type of thing. Again, someone decided to make them compulsory. It wasn't ERCOT. They didn't have the ability to mandate that. That's above their pay grade. So it's not, they're doing what they can with what they've been given by the legislature and the things that have been delegated to them by the PUC, and then at the expense of what the Railroad Commission does as well. So I don't know that I would necessarily, blame them as hard as some other people are at this point.
It all rests with the legislators and the governors.
To wrap up, gentlemen, and this has been a great discussion, one of the best we've ever had here. But I'm curious. We can end on this. What is your prediction? Do we see an overreaction to this crisis, or do we see an underreaction? So I'm talking about do we see policymakers go overboard, or perhaps, or do we see not enough done to prevent it from happening again?
It'll be interesting to see what happens. The governor's talking about making sure power supplies are there. So I don't know if that means that we'll restart the idea of a capacity market or something. I don't know that necessarily would have helped in this case, because we would have needed something like a 40% reserve margin in order to ride through this event. So I don't know. It's tough based on the type of market we have now, which has provided cheap energy for a super long amount of time. But yeah, obviously we can't have what we had happen before, so we'll have to do something.
Yeah, we're going to see either a capacity market, which would be an expedient approach, or we might see a push. Perhaps back to vertical integration. This is $100 billion hit to GDP for Texas. It's on the governor's desk. He has to address this. The market is so structured that it needs to be fixed. Don't know how that's going to work out.
Well, I think a lot of people feel the same way I do. Texas is just too big to fail, and so we will have to see some kind of improvement. We like to boast of ourselves as the energy capital of the world, but like everybody, we're not perfect, and it'll be interesting to see how this situation evolves. But for now, guys, thank you so much for giving me a portion of your time today, and thank you everyone for watching. I hope you learned a little something about this event. And keep checking on SPE Live for future topics. And really, thank you again. Cheers, everyone.